Hi, this is Eve with True Crime and Coke. You are about to listen to an EDUsode. These are shorter episodes dedicated to educational information ranging from forensic terminology to interesting FBI files. Or you can check out one of my regular episodes. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube under True Crime and Coke. So, let's get started. Hi, this is Eve. Welcome to EDUsode 20. We are on part 5 and are on motivations and types of serial murder, the symposium model. So let's just jump right into it. Over the past 20 years, law enforcement and experts from a number of varying disciplines have attempted to identify specific motivations for serial murderers and to apply those motivations to different typologies developed for classifying serial murderers. These range from simple, definitive models to complex, multiple category typologies that are laden with inclusion requirements. Most typologies are too cumbersome to be utilized by law enforcement during an active serial murder investigation, and they may not be helpful in identifying an offender. The attendees at the symposium discussed the issues surrounding motivation and the use of typologies to categorize varying types of serial murderer. Identifying motivations in the investigation of a crime is a standard procedure for law enforcement. Typically, motivation provides police with the means to narrow the potential suspect pool. The same logical steps are taken when investigating homicide cases. As most homicides are committed by someone known to the victim, police focus on the relationships closest to the victim. This is a successful strategy for most murder investigations. The majority of serial murderers, however, are not acquainted with or involved in a consensual relationship with their victims. For the most part, serial murder involves strangers with no visible relationship between the offender and the victim. This distinguishes a serial murder investigation as a more nebulous undertaking than that of other crimes. Since the investigations generally lack an obvious connection between the offender and the victim, investigators instead attempt to discern the motivations behind the murders as a way to narrow their investigative focus. Serial murder crime scenes can have bizarre features that may cloud the identification of a motive. The behavior of a serial murderer at crime scenes may evolve throughout the series of crimes and manifest different interactions between an offender and a victim. It is also extremely difficult to identify a single motivation when there is more than one offender involved in the series. The attendees at the symposium made the following observations. Motive generally may be difficult to determine in a serial murder investigation. A serial murderer may have multiple motives for committing his crimes. A serial murderer's motives may evolve both within a single murder as well throughout the murder series. The classification of motivations should be limited to observable behavior at the crime scene. Even if a motive can be identified, it may not be helpful in identifying a serial murderer. Utilizing investigative resources to discern the motive instead of identifying the offender may derail the investigation. Investigators should not necessarily equate a serial murderer's motivation with the level of injury. Regardless of the motive, serial murderers commit their crimes because they want to. The exception of this would be those few killers suffering from a severe mental illness. To assist law enforcement in narrowing the pool of suspects, attendees at the symposium suggested that broad, non-inclusive categories of motivations be utilized as guidelines for investigation. The following categories listed below represent general categories and are not intended to be a complete measure of serial offenders or their motivation. Anger. Anger is a motivation in which an offender displays rage or hostility towards a certain subgroup of the population or with society as a whole. Criminal enterprise. Criminal enterprise is a motivation in which the offender benefits in status or monetary compensation by committing murder that is drug, gang, or organized crime related. Financial gain. Financial gain is a motivation in which the offender benefits monetarily from killing. Examples of these types of crimes are black widow killings, robbery, homicides, or multiple killings involving insurance or welfare fraud. Ideology is a motivation to commit murders in order to further the goals and ideas of a specific individual or group. Examples of these include terrorist groups or an individual or individuals who attack a specific racial, gender, or ethnic group. Power, thrill is a motivation in which the offender feels empowered and/or excited when he kills his victims. Psychosis is a situation in which the offender is suffering from a severe mental illness and killing because of that illness. This may include auditory and/or visual hallucinations and paranoid, grandiose, or bizarre delusions. Sexually based is a motivation driven by the sexual needs and desires of the offender. There may or may not be overt sexual contact reflected in the crime scene. An offender selects a victim, regardless of the category, based upon availability, vulnerability, and desirability. Availability is explained as a lifestyle of the victim or circumstances in which the victim is involved that allow the offender access to the victim. Vulnerability is defined as the degree to which the victim is susceptible to attack by the offender. Desirability is described as the appeal of the victim to the offender. Desirability involves numerous factors based upon the motivation of the offender and may include factors dealing with race, gender, ethnic background, age of the victim, or other specific preferences the offender determines. Part 6. Investigative Issues and Best Practices. Attendees at the symposium identified successful investigative practices for solving serial murder cases. These factors were central to the discussions: identification of a serial murder series, leadership, task force organization, resource augmentation, communication, data management, analytical tools, medical examiners and coroners, administrative issues, training, and officer assistance programs. Symposium participants listed the initial identification of a homicide series as the primary investigative challenge. Historically, the first indication that a serial murder was at work was when 2 or more cases were linked by forensic or behavioral evidence. Identifying a homicide series is easier in rapidly developing high-profile cases involving low-risk victims. These cases are reported to law enforcement upon discovery of the crimes and draw immediate media attention. In contrast, identifying a series involving a high-risk victim in multiple jurisdictions is much more difficult. This is primarily due to the high-risk lifestyle and transitory nature of the victims. Additionally, the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies and differing records management systems impede the linkage of cases to a common offender. Attendees stressed the importance of law enforcement networking with other investigative agencies and cited the National Law Enforcement Teletype System, NLETS, messages, VICAP alerts, and the Law Enforcement Online LEO website as alternative mechanisms for sharing information to help determine other linked cases. The use of the FBI's NCAVC, both the Behavioral Analysis Units and the Violent Crime Apprehension Program in linking potential cases was also encouraged. High-profile investigations present a multitude of leadership challenges for law enforcement, from investigators to police executives. Law enforcement personnel may face external pressures from political entities, victims' families, and the media. Collectively, strong management throughout the chain of command must continually reinforce the supreme goal of the investigation: to arrest and prosecute the offender. Attendees at the symposium agreed that in successful serial murder investigations, the roles of both investigators and supervisors were clearly delineated. The investigative function is the primary mission, and all other activities are in support of that mission. In serial murder cases, the actual investigation should be directed by competent homicide investigators who have the experience to direct and focus the investigative process. Law enforcement administrators should not run the investigation, but rather ensure that the investigators have the resources to do their job. Supervisors should also act as buffers between investigators and the other levels of command. There are several other strategies law enforcement executives may consider while preparing for these intense investigations, and these are completing memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, between different law enforcement agencies in order to obtain mutual support agreements and commitment of manpower, resources, and overtime. Identifying all resources that may be needed during the investigation and maintaining detailed lists of available resources. Establishing good working relationships with other departments prior to the crisis through networking, scheduled meetings, and joint training. Providing training opportunities in the latest techniques and methods of homicide investigation. Additional observations regarding leadership and task force operations include communication or administrative issues should be restricted to management personnel of the various agencies so as not to distract investigators. The intense pressure in high-profile investigations may at times decrease logical decision-making. Tunnel vision and impulsivity should be avoided. Law enforcement administration and each of the participating law enforcement agencies should present a unified front by agreeing to a written investigative strategy that outlines the investigative goals, the roles of the agencies, and establishes a clear and concise chain of command. Command staff should focus on providing and managing the resources investigators need to solve the case, rather than directing the investigation. A major problem identified by attendees at the symposium was the issue of micromanagement, when a supervisor attempts to personally direct every action in an investigation rather than allowing investigators to perform their jobs independently. They exacerbate problems in these high-profile investigations. While law enforcement attracts positive individuals with strong personalities, management should encourage all involved personnel to leave their egos at the door. This ensures that personality differences among investigators do not become a distraction to the investigation. Investigators who lack the ability to collaborate with colleagues can hinder the investigation and should not be assigned to investigative teams. Task force organization. Once a serial murder series has been identified, it is important for the involved law enforcement agencies to work together. There are a number of operational and investigative issues critical to the successful establishment of an investigative task force. Initially, a lead agency for the task force should be designated and will assume the primary investigative role. The choice of a lead agency is based upon a number of factors, including the number and viability of the cases, available resources, and investigative experience. Once established, all law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation should have representation in the task force. Any outlying agencies should also be included, even if they do not have an identified case in the investigation. An effective and reliable investigative model identifies a lead investigator and co-investigator who, regardless of rank, are given complete control of the investigation. These investigators review all incoming information, collate the information, and assign leads. If the flow of incoming information becomes unmanageable due to excessive influx of investigative tips, the lead investigators can delegate this responsibility to an experienced investigator who will act as a lead control officer. Administrators must look beyond the traditional method of assigning the next available investigators, regardless of skill, or assigning investigators who have no desire to be involved in a major case. Consequently, law enforcement administrators must assign the most qualified investigator or investigators to lead the current case. The lead investigator must have the experience, dedication, and tenacity to direct all aspects of the investigation. They should also, with management's support, have the ability to select a cadre of investigators and support personnel and assign such personnel as the investigation dictates. In serial murder investigations, the lead investigators must handle all crime scene activities and related leads, as each incident may be interwoven. It is the responsibility of the lead investigators or the lead control investigator to ensure relevant information is distributed to the entire task force. At the onset of the task force, the lead investigator should immediately implement a pre-planned task force model. Common to most models is the need to establish an information management system to track tips and leads in the case. This computer system should account for the idiosyncrasies of the investigation while being flexible enough to handle any contingency. All personnel should be familiar with its operation, and it should be pre-tested to ensure viability in investigative conditions. Primary to the investigation is sufficient manpower to successfully investigate and prosecute the case. The overwhelming consensus consensus from the attendees is that the assignment of excessive numbers of personnel to the investigation may be counterproductive. A small group of experienced homicide investigators under the direction of the lead investigator is far more effective than a large number of less experienced investigators or investigators who are experienced in different areas of criminal activity. Additional personnel may be brought in for specific tasks as necessary. There should be a bifurcation of responsibility between the administrator of the case and the investigation of the case. The task running the investigation is the responsibility of the lead investigator. The administration provides all of the necessary support, including procurement of equipment, funding, and manpower. As an example, task force administrators must obtain authority for priority requests for services from the forensic laboratory and other service providers. The lead investigator and the administrators on the task force must have close cooperative working relationship, maintaining their own areas of responsibility. Assignment liaison personnel in serial homicide cases is highly recommended. The highest priority is the families of the victims, who will be supportive of the investigative efforts when they believe the investigators are competent and all available resources are being used to identify and arrest the offender. An investigator with exceptional interpersonal and communication skills should be assigned to maintain constant contact with the families, keeping them apprised of the progress of the investigation and any pending press releases. Liaison must also be maintained with the numerous support entities, both inside and outside the task force, including the prosecutor's office, the forensic laboratory, the medical examiner's office, and surrounding law enforcement agencies. Additionally, a list of available experts in specific forensic and related fields should be compiled and liaison established for use in the investigation. As long as the flow of information is manageable, one individual can be assigned to multiple liaison duties. As the investigation continues, the manpower requirements of the task force will increase for various reasons, including increasing the number of investigators and support staff. Restraints must be practiced by task force administrators to avoid the use of excess personnel. As previously discussed, the use of fewer personnel may be more effective. The lead investigator is in the best position to recognize when additional personnel are needed. The administrator's responsibility is to provide the authority for the permanent or temporary reassignment of the requested number of personnel to the task force. If additional personnel are needed to expand the task force, the reassignment should be for the duration of the task force to ensure continuity of investigative information. However, for short-term needs, such as a specific neighborhood canvass or roadblock canvass, personnel can be reassigned temporarily to complete the specific task and then be returned to their normal duties. In either event, the arrival of new personnel should be pre-planned and a detailed case briefing provided. This briefing should include an explanation of their specific assignment, their work hours, details of the investigation as it applies to their assignment, expected standards for report completion, and a complete list of contact numbers. Additionally, personnel should be cautioned about discussing case-sensitive information with anyone outside of authorized law enforcement personnel. Arbitrary rotation of personnel should be avoided as it negatively affects the continuity of the investigation. Rotation of personnel should only occur if requested by the investigator or there are officer assistance issues. If the task force is disbanded and later reinstated, the original investigators should be utilized. Communication. Attendees stress the importance of disseminating information to the investigators engaged in a serial murder investigation through the following. Daily briefings are essential for investigators, especially when there are different work shifts. Periodic summary briefings are also necessary for managers and patrol officers. These can be accomplished via emails or at roll call and should be conducted by investigative personnel. Communication on the operational level is paramount, especially in task force investigations and when serial murder cases involve multiple states. As all information must be shared seamlessly, teleconferences may not sufficiently allow for the flow of information. Face-to-face case briefings are suggested. Submitting VICAP reports on solved and unsolved murders, attempted murders, and sexual assaults for the inclusion in the VICAP database is strongly recommended and may facilitate the linkage of unknown related cases for law enforcement agencies. Data management. A common problem in serial investigations occurs occurs when data is not entered into the electronic database in a timely manner. Useful leads are lost when investigators are overloaded with information. The following suggestions were provided regarding data management issues. In order to avoid time lags, reports should be written as soon as the investigative lead is completed. If reports are not finished before the end of the investigator's shift, the lead investigator may not have time to review those reports. This will lead to a backlog of reports containing pertinent and timely investigative information. Sufficient time should be allocated during work shifts to complete reports. Information should be obtained, documented, and distributed in a standardized manner to maintain consistency among different agencies. Ideally, reports should be computer-generated to ease the communication issues. Systems similar to the FBI's Rapid Start computerized case management system should be utilized to effectively organize and collate lead information. Computerized systems promote the analysis of a tremendous amount of data. There should be sufficient personnel committed to ensure that data is recorded into the system in a timely manner. A murder book or series of murder books should be created and maintained. Murder books contain all the pertinent investigative information and are traditionally in paper format but can also be developed electronically. All rough notes should be maintained and entered into evidence. Reports should be distributed to all participating law enforcement agencies and the prosecutor's office. Analytical tools. The wide range of analytical resources available to law enforcement agencies is typically underutilized at the onset of a serial murder investigation. Due to the voluminous amount of information characteristic of high-profile investigations, critical lead information may be lost. The implementation of a tested and reliable case management system, as previously discussed, coupled with competent analytical staff, is imperative in serial murder investigations. Crime analysts offer critical support to the investigation by developing timelines on victims and suspects, compiling matrices to highlight case elements, and providing general analytical support. Analysts should be assigned to the initial investigation group so information can be sorted, compared, and charted to provide timely lead information. It is recommended that a review team of experienced investigators be formed to assist the lead investigator in filtering through the information gathered by analysts. The team should consist of 2 to 4 investigators from within the involved agencies, as well as the crime analysts. The team must remain intact throughout the investigation to maintain the case integrity. Many agencies are not supported by an actual crime analysis unit or do not employ experienced analysts. In such cases, the agency should contact their neighboring jurisdictions or the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime for assistance. Symposium attendees also discussed the importance of the behavioral aspects of the investigation and recommended the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to be utilized for the multitude of services it provides, to include crime scene analysis, offender profiles, case linkage analysis, interview strategies, and prosecution strategy. The case consultations can be conducted at the BAU office in Quantico, Virginia, or a team of BAU staff members can respond to the respective agency to personally view the crime scenes and discuss the behavioral issues with the pertinent task force members. Medical examiners and coroners operate according to their different state mandates and vary as to the thoroughness of their investigations. Consistent procedures to collect, record, and retrieve case information are important in linking cases in other jurisdictions. The following recommendations were made concerning medical examiners in serial murder investigations. Medical examiners should share information on autopsies and potentially related cases. Joint meetings with investigators can provide additional background information on these cases. A single medical examiner should be utilized in serial cases occurring within the same jurisdiction. Once a series has been identified that involves several jurisdictions, the various medical examiner offices may consider performing joint autopsy procedures to ensure continuity in evidence collection. Investigators should also ensure submissions of all unidentified victims to the FBI Laboratory's National Missing Persons DNA database. Investigators should also ensure the entry of unidentified remains recovered into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and VICAB. Administrative issues. Law enforcement agencies should review their current administrative policies relating to maintenance and storage of unsolved homicide case materials. Top priority should be given to these cases by extending the storage time limit and may include the following. Mirror the FBI's NCAVC 50-year minimum mandate to keep copies of all unsolved cases. Retain records of unsolved homicide cases and the accompanying evidence until the case is closed. Records should be electronically converted. Evidence storage should be available for long-term storage of forensic evidence in murder cases. Submit cases to the FBI's VICAP database, which maintains case information indefinitely. Resources and finances. It is essential that an investigative agency have the resources available in order to establish the initial setup for a task force, both from financial and logistic perspectives. There should be a contingency plan in place to handle the resource issues in a major investigation. Buildings, office space, computers, phones, vehicles, food, and other necessities should be considered in the plan. Utilizing non-law enforcement agencies such as the fire department for use of their high-tech equipment may also be included in the plan. It was recommended that agencies develop emergency response plans and establish MOUs at the local, state, and national level. Training. Training continues to be an issue for all law enforcement departments. Complex homicide investigations, especially those involving serial murder cases, depend upon the experience and abilities of investigators to effectively conduct the investigation. With the retirement of many experienced homicide investigators, newer investigators need training and exposure to a wide range of investigative techniques. Attendees also suggested the utilization of standardized training for homicide investigator, crime analysts, and medical examiners. Officer assistance programs. The brutality of the crime scenes, the senseless, repetitive acts inflicted on the victims, and a sense of helplessness in failing to catch the offender are all factors that may impact the emotional well-being of investigators involved in a serial murder case. Burnout, stress, and hopelessness are just some of the feelings that may affect members of the investigative team. To combat these issues, attendees suggest the following: regular debriefings, access to critical incident counselors, mental health evaluations upon request, adequate time off for investigators. Note: the majority of attendees agreed there should be a published General Guide to Serial Murder Investigations, building upon the Multi-Agency Investigative Team Manual, MAIT, and addressing specific issues such as cooperative investigative models, investigative methods, case linkage, crime scene techniques, MOUs, training for police, medical examiners, and crime analysts, the role of regional intelligence centers, the integration of BAU and VICAP, and the role of federal law enforcement. That is the end of part 6. This was kind of a longer EDUsode. Next EDUsode will be starting with part 7, forensic issues in serial murder cases. And until then, have a good evening.